Welcome back to our next lesson, this one on the Scramble for Africa. The goal in this lesson is to be able to describe what led to European colonization of the African continent. As always, make sure you're following along, filling in those blanks on your note sheet, and answering those reflection questions at the end. So before we can answer how Europeans colonized and conquered Africa, we should probably ask ourselves, why did Europeans want to do this in the first place? And there's several reasons. One, well, money. Money is at the heart of a lot of things in history. As industrialization spread, European factories needed a lot more raw materials in order to make the things that they wanted to sell, and more people to sell those things to. Remember from previous units that Europe had kind of gotten kicked out of North and South America by this point, so they needed a new target for colonization. Colonization's goal is always to extract resources from the colony and bring that wealth and resources to the homeland that did the conquering and colonizing. The New World is mostly revolted by this time, right? If you look at this map over here in 1800, you can see that most of this land is controlled by the Spanish Empire. But look at the green here. That is massive. And then, of course, the yellow is controlled by the Portuguese Empire. You still see some remnants of the Dutch colonies and the French over here. But by 1830, just a mere 30 years later, you look over on this map over here on the right side, and all this light purple represents countries that are now independent. They are areas that are completely separate from their once powerful European empires. So Europeans had to look elsewhere for both resources and markets to sell to. Now, Asian markets were starting to open up. After all, the British controlled pretty much most of India at this point. The French are kind of kicking around over here in what we call Indochina. You got the Philippines right here, where the United States is actually playing a role at this point. The Netherlands have this yellow area. The British are still down here in Australia. So these markets over here in Asia and Australia, they're starting to open up. But what's stopping full domination of Europeans is the powerful Chinese Empire and the Japanese Empire as well. So they're starting to push back, and while Europeans are making inroads in Asia, they just don't have as many opportunities because of these powerful empires that are keeping them out. Another common driving force in events in history is religious beliefs. Now, Christians saw themselves in Europe and in America, really, as the highest form of civilization. Specifically, white Christians saw themselves this way. And they believed, because they were so more advanced than everyone else, that it was their duty to civilize Africa and save their souls by converting them away from Islam and their traditional animist beliefs. Now, you'll remember that historically, a lot of Africa has dominated by the religious belief of Islam here in the north, in the east, and in the south and the west. It's more traditional animist beliefs. And so these European Christians were saying, it is our duty to save their souls by converting them to Christianity. And while religion is getting in this racist belief that Africa is inferior and needs to be saved, unfortunately, early scientists are also jumping in on this, using Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution to argue that Africans were actually not human. They were a separate, less evolved species, and some slight physical differences were proof of this, according to these racists trying to create their own version of science to justify their racist beliefs. These social Darwinists, as they call themselves, believe that other races were inferior, and it was the white man's burden to improve them with civilization. This is best exemplified by this cartoon from the period where you see Uncle Sam, the United States, carrying a basket of people who are drawn in a very racist way from Africa, the Philippines, and other areas. And you see this man supposed to represent the United Kingdom, who's bringing up people from India, from parts of Africa, from the Middle East, other areas that the British had colonized, right? And if you look, they're carrying them up these rocks that say barbarism, oppression, ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition, and they're bringing them all the way up to the very top where civilization is. This is what they meant by white man's burden, that because white people were so more advanced than everyone else, it was our duty to drag everyone else up to the peak of civilization. Now, again, European civilization is not the peak of civilization. As we've been talking about time and time again, there's so many impressive things about all these cultures we've been studying that in some ways they're more advanced than Europeans. In some ways they're not as advanced as Europeans. But this idea that Europeans were the pinnacle of all civilization, it's just not true, and it was used to justify colonization. They also try to use science to justify their racist beliefs. They started pushing this failed branch of science known as eugenics, which is a belief that evolution can be guided by stopping people with inferior traits from having kids with people who have superior traits. The idea here is you want two people with superior traits to marry and have children because their children will pass on those, quote, superior traits. If you have a person with a superior trait marrying someone with an inferior trait, then the fear is that it will dilute the genetics and you'll have children who aren't as perfect as they could be. Now, there is, of course, just like in astronomy and astrology, there's a nugget of something there that's science. There's a nugget of like genetics here, right? This is before DNA was discovered, though. However, the things they were calling inferior traits were things that just white Europeans didn't like darker skin, or what they considered low intelligence, or people who had a history of committing crime, right? Darker skin, that's to justify the areas that they're conquering, colonizing. Lower intelligence, doesn't mean it's genetic or it's a actual physical trait. Some people don't have high intelligence because they didn't have the same educational opportunities. And then committing crime, that they thought this was something that was actually passed on from parent to child. And they did all kinds of really weird things and measurements to try to quote unquote prove that they were right about all this. They compared skull shapes and things like that, and again, use this as a very racist way to try to justify and saying, look, Africans or people from other areas of the world aren't fully human. Again, these are very racist, discredited ideas that have no basis in actual science, but this is the idea that they were pushing called eugenics, right? And so if you could selectively breed people by either making sure people had the better traits or always marrying people with better traits, and stopping people with what they called inferior traits from having kids, you could overall improve humanity. Again, this is all super racist. But despite the fact that it's not actually based in science and it's just super racist, America, like a lot of European countries, start to pass racist laws based on these ideas. This is why so many places, including Wisconsin, where we are right now, had laws that both banned interracial marriage for a while, but also forced sterilization on men and women they deemed, quote, undesirable. So that would be people that they said had low IQs, or who committed too many crimes, or just had too dark of a skin color. And by sterilization, what this would mean would be for women having their uteruses surgically removed against their wishes, sometimes not even being told that's what's happening. For men, it was less invasive with vasectomies, but still, this was a practice that even here in Wisconsin, up until around 1935, still we had these laws on the books. These are ideas that actually we shared in common with the people rising to power over in Europe that will one day become called Nazis. In fact, in the 1930s, there were a lot of people in America who agreed with what the Nazis were saying and doing, because both Americans and Germans agreed with these ideas of eugenics. It's an uncomfortable thing, but it's true. There is that connection between Nazi Germany and the United States and these eugenic ideas. Okay, so now we know why Europeans wanted to colonize Africa, why they wanted to take it over. But a more interesting question here after that is, well, why hadn't they done so already? After all, Europe and Africa are right next to each other on the map, right? Europeans had been visiting Africa since at least the Bronze Age. And yet, Europeans colonized North and South America long before they had their ability to conquer Africa and colonize that. So what happened here? Why didn't they go to Africa first? So again, yeah, North and South America were conquered almost 300 years before Africa was conquered and colonized by Europeans. And there are several key reasons for this, right? There were powerful African empires all across Africa in key locations, right? In West Africa, Central, Southern Africa. In the north, you had the Ottomans. So you had these powerful empires, like the Benin, Congo, Ethiopia, Mali. They had a lot of wealth, they had a lot of power, and they were protecting themselves from European invasion. Now, of course, we had powerful empires over here in North and South America that also put up a fight, but Africa had some other advantages that the civilizations in the Americas just did not have. For one, these African empires controlled the trade routes into the central part of the continent. This meant that Europeans couldn't really get directly be part of this, and it kind of locked them out because, yes, they had things that Africans would want to trade for, right? And trade can be a way to kind of get your feet in the door to begin the conquest. However, the African empires across Africa just kind of kept the Europeans out, and all the things Europeans had, well, they were trading with the empires on the coasts, and that was then being traded by those empires further in. And so there really wasn't that same ability. In order to get into the continent, right, you could try to bypass these empires maybe by using the river system, but a lot of Africa's rivers are unnavigable. It means that they have rapids and waterfalls. It makes it very hard to actually travel through these rivers all the way into the interior, right? And so this makes it difficult to send troops and supplies deep into the continent in order to maintain an army for conquest and colonization. And so the rivers were also keeping Europeans out. Probably one of the biggest differences is the diseases in Africa, right? Unlike Native Americans, Africans were not as devastated by diseases spread by European armies and settlers. And this is because essentially Africa had been trading with Asia and Europe for thousands of years. And as you know, disease follows trade routes. And so many Africans had already been exposed to the diseases that Europeans carried with them, and just weren't as affected by them as Native Americans, who had absolutely no immunity to them because they've never had any interaction with those diseases. So this eliminated one of the large advantages that Europeans had when they conquered the Americas. At the same time, Europeans had no defense against malaria, a disease that can be found all across Africa. Even today, it's extremely deadly, with one African child dying every 60 seconds to malaria. Malaria is a disease that spreads through a parasite that lives inside mosquitoes, and it's extremely deadly. It's even more deadly to Europeans and the cattle and horses that they relied on. And so these mosquitoes would bite Europeans, get them sick, and they would die. They would bite the horses that Europeans used for traveling. Those horses would die. The cattle that they used for meat and for food, they would die from malaria. And this was a real impediment to Europeans getting into the continent. In contrast, African civilizations developed differently. They developed around avoiding malaria. So they would intentionally build their towns high up in dry areas where mosquitoes aren't going to be populating, which would stop the spread of malaria. They also selectively bred their animals to be more resistant to malaria, so they wouldn't die off from it. Communities were also much smaller, and the smaller the community, the harder it is for diseases to spread. And finally, many Africans had, not all, but there were a significant portion, developed a genetic mutation called sickle cell. And that's basically where the blood cell looks more like a circle instead of like a round donut shape. Think about your biology classes. And that had a way of like stopping the parasite from causing as much damage. So this provided some natural immunity. Now, of course, sickle cells also cause an anemia problem, but that's another thing for genetics or a health class. All right, so we've covered why Europeans would want to colonize and conquer Africa. We got into why they were unable to do so far up to this point. Now let's talk about how do they overcome those challenges in the late 1800s and eventually take over almost the entire continent rather quickly. So the first part of this was the destabilization of those African empires, right? There had been the transatlantic slave trade going on for almost about 300 years at this point. That is millions of people being drained from the continent of Africa, weakening it. At the same time, the slave trade was pitting these African empires against each other because if you're up here and you refuse to trade with the Europeans, they'd go further down the coast to one of your rivals, give them the guns, and then they would go after you and enslave you and sell you to the Europeans. And so you saw this mass destabilization happening with constant warfare, the depopulation of Africa, from the deaths from those warfare, but also from the millions of people who were kidnapped and enslaved and sent out of Africa, right? So these once powerful empires are getting weakened by centuries of this, and it gives Europeans a better military chance. Also, it gives Europeans a chance to break into these trade routes that those empires once controlled, making some of these African cultures more dependent on Europeans now. The rivers problem was solved by, well, steam technology, right? That steam engine we talked about in the Industrial Revolution, miniaturized and used to be put on trains for steam trains, but you now have boats powered by this. And these steamships had an easier time of getting through the rapid areas that previously European ships just couldn't navigate. So now they can get more soldiers and supplies deeper into the continent faster to support larger armies in their conquest. And then there's malaria treatment. Europeans discovered in the rainforests of South America there was this special tree that cochina. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but essentially this tree produces a chemical called quinine that they learned has the ability to kill the malaria parasite, and they discovered it thanks to the scientific revolution of people experimenting with different natural plants and then finding the chemicals inside the plants that have different medicinal properties to it. So now Europeans have a way to protect themselves from the deadly malaria virus. Now, the reason Oliver Cromwell's face is here is you might remember him. He's that Puritan from the English Civil War who hated Christmas and all that. And, well, he was so Puritan and so much of a Protestant and so much hated Catholicism that he actually died of malaria even though he knew quinine could cure him. He refused to take it because he said, well, that medicine was discovered by Catholics. Catholics take that medicine, and I refuse to do anything a Catholic would do. And so he refused the medicine, and he wound up dying of malaria because of it. A quite historical self-own, if you will. Then there, of course, is the invention of the Maxim gun, the very first machine gun. So Africans, like the Zulu people here, led by Shaka Zulu, fought back very bravely. Some of them had access to single-bolt rifles. Many had traditional spears and traditional shields, and that's what they were fighting with. And Europeans came with the very first machine guns. This Industrial Revolution put an end to a lot of African, at least military resistance, as Africans had the numerical advantage. There were just more of them than there were Europeans. However, now you could have one person with a machine gun that automatically reloads and fires just constantly, can mow down an entire, platoon of African soldiers. And this kind of gives Europeans that final big advantage they need to take over the continent. So in summation, why is all this a big idea? Why does this matter? Why should we learn this? Well, first and foremost, it's the racist ideas of racial superiority that are really, really developing at this time. They're going to be used to push the conquest. Also will soon be used to justify the Holocaust in the coming lessons. So there is a clear connection between this. Second, Africa is still dealing with the fallout from the damage done by this era. Africa is one of the richest continents in the world when it comes to natural resources, but African nations are still living in poverty in many areas as a direct consequence to what happens in this period. And then finally, industrialization. It's used for the first time in warfare on a large scale and drastically changes the way wars are fought. Africa becomes the testing ground for a lot of the weapons that are going to be used in World War I. It's also going to give Europeans a lot of false confidence when it comes to wars. They're going to think of themselves as these powerful, unstoppable empires because they have these amazing weapons and soldiers that can't be beat. The problem is they're using these weapons against people who don't have them. They have no idea what's going to happen when you're an empire that has these weapons and you go to war with another empire that also has those weapons. And they're going to quickly find out in World War I, it's not a recipe for success. All right, we've reached the end, so as always, take a few moments here and write down today's goal. Go back to the beginning of the video, go back to the top of your note sheet, whatever it is, write down that goal again so you know what it was you were supposed to have learned in this lesson. Then identify 3 important facts from the notes that help you understand, show that you've met this goal. 3 things you can use in defense of, yes, I've learned this goal. And third, write at least one question you still have, right? Show some curiosity. What is still nagging at you? If you can't think of anything, seriously, stop. Read over your notes again and ask yourself, what is one more thing that you would like to know? One more thing, one more question. How does this connect to other things we've talked about, right? All right, thank you for that. And when we get back to class, we're going to be moving forward in history and seeing how this connects to World War I.